welcome to tonight's lecture with Patrick Crowley, Catastrophe at Kut. A very sobering tale, but one that we feel ought to be shared with as many people as possible. We're very grateful to CPM International for sponsoring tonight's talk as well. And don't forget, at the end of the talk, there is a live Q&A. As you can see, I'm back in the museum along with the staff and volunteers, and we're welcoming people every day. So if you haven't managed to get back in yet to see Spy Oxfordshire, or just to come by and look at all of the exhibition pods, we'd be very grateful to see you. Don't forget to donate if you can, and I really hope that you enjoy tonight's talk. Many thanks. Bye-bye.
Well, it's a delight to support the Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum this evening. This is a story about Kut in 1916, or when it surrendered in 1916. Kut was just a simple town in the middle of Mesopotamia, what is now Iraq. Now, 1916 is a year that people remember for various reasons, mainly because of the Battle of the Somme, but also there were the French at Verdun, there was the closing months in Gallipoli, there was the Irish Rebellion, and also for the Navy, the Battle of Jutland. So Kut is a very small story in this, but Kut was a major disaster for the British Indian Army. If you wrote a history on any regiment or on the First World War, there are such big issues that this sort of story gets lost. So hopefully we can recap on it this evening, because it really does link in with the local county of Oxfordshire in particular. Because we're talking about the 1st Battalion of the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire 43rd Light Infantry. Part of the regiment was going to be besieged in Kut and would end up surrendering and going into captivity, with a very small amount of them returning home. Another part of the regiment, which was specially formed, would end up trying to break through in the relief force, but suffering horrendous casualties. So we end up, as you can see on this map, examining a place on the River Tigris. It is between Basra, which is somewhere very familiar with modern soldiers, and Baghdad. And Baghdad is a place that I served in at one stage, and that's one of the reasons why I took an interest in this particular story. And the 1st Battalion of the Ox and Bucks found themselves besieged in Kut. But another part of that regiment, the 2nd 43rd, were in the relief force that never made it through. And ultimately, this particular place called Kut surrendered, and it was a disaster. More of that in a moment. As you can see from this slide, it was even a disaster, and everyone knew it was a major disaster during the First World War, and there was a Mesopotamia commission in 1917 which followed yet another commission which examined what went wrong. And you can see that the initial analysis was that the logistics went wrong, the administration went wrong. And they did, but actually there are a lot more things that went wrong as well. This is the scale of the disaster. As you look at this emaciated soldier, 3,000 were killed in the siege, 2,500 wounded, 13,000 taken prisoner. Now that was 3,000 British and 10,000 Indian. Because of course this operation revolved around the Indian Army, which had a mixture of Indian troops and British Army troops. It also involved 4 divisions worth of troops, so considerable forces. 4,000 were to die in captivity, and 23,000 casualties took place in the relief force. The commander who got most of the publicity was the man on the ground with the 6th Division. And the Ox and Bucks found themselves within this division as time went on. And this was someone called Major General Townsend. He was what, in modern day army terms, you'd call a real thruster. He was nicknamed Chitral Charlie because of a successful defence of a town in the northwest frontier at the end of the 19th century. He was keen on studying Napoleon, and so he had the other nickname of Alphonse. And he arranged his career so he went to the best places at the best time in order to gain promotion. Well, he would be the commander who surrendered at Kut. Now, the Indian Army at that stage was reorganised as a result of the 1857 mutiny or rebellion, if you like. There was a balance of British and Indian troops in each of the different formations of the army. And here on this slide, you can see the balance of 17 Infantry Brigade, which eventually was under the command of Brigadier General Houghton. He would actually die in the Siege of Kut. And as you can see, you've got the 43rd Light Infantry, the Light Bobs, as they were nicknamed, together with 3 Indian regiments, because in those days that was the backbone, the British backbone of each of those brigades. And on this slide, you can see the heritage of the 43rd Light Infantry, your local regiment. In 1908, it became the 1st Battalion of the Ox and Bucks Light Infantry, and as I said earlier, the 2nd Battalion being the ex-52nd of Foot. In 1881, it became associated with Oxfordshire. In 1958, the 1st Green Jackets, and in 1966, the Royal Green Jackets, and of course, in 2007, the Modern Rifles Regiment. So I'm going to cover what you can see here. To the fall of Kut, being imprisoned, and then a little assessment at the end. On this slide, you can see a slightly more detailed map. And you've got the River Tigris, the River Euphrates coming up from Basra. And there was a general drift of the Allied force, the Indian Army, up those rivers. And they went up those rivers and found they were successful. They won in different battles. Fundamentally, the reason why we were there in the first place was to seize oil. So perhaps you can equate that with modern times. So the oil fields of the Fao Peninsula were seized. The Turkish enemy or Ottoman enemy were killed, destroyed. There were successes. And these local successes led to further mission creep up the rivers. And then people started to think, well, if we're doing this well and the Turkish enemy are not that effective, why don't we take Baghdad? This is an opportunity for a victory. And Townsend, who commanded 6th Division, of which 17th Brigade and the Ox and Bucks were in, was very successful at the beginning. And they take various places relatively easily. Kurna, Awaz, Amara, Nazariya, Kut, Ctesiphon. They would move up the River Tigris. But as they moved up the river, the enemy became more capable. And consistently, the Indian Army, British Army, underestimated that Turkish enemy. So across to a few personalities shown on this slide. Here you can see Sir Percy Cox, a political agent. He was actually a general, and he was encouraging a move towards Baghdad. And then you've got the likes of Field Marshal Robertson, from private to Field Marshal, the chief of the Imperial General Staff. He was a Westerner. He wanted victory on the Western Front. He didn't want too much involvement in these sideshows. And so you had this clash between Westerners and Easterners. The Viceroy, the Secretary of State for India on the mainland. All these people had different influences, but they all had different ideas. And this is one of the problems about this campaign. Some people wanted to go all the way to Baghdad, and others didn't. So the unity of command at the strategic level was a challenge. If we drop down to the personalities on the ground, you can see here there was a General Nixon. He was encouraging the move forward. General Lake took over from General Nixon. But the actual tactical commander in this instance, who seizes Kut initially and moves into Kut, is Townsend. And then you've got the Turkish Nurettin and Halil, very capable commanders within the 6th Army. And behind the scenes, another character, a German called von der Goltz. And he was very influential on the Turks. And he was the one that when Kut was occupied by the Allies, he said, surround the place, don't attack the place, surround the place, and you can defeat them. And eventually he was correct, and they followed his tactics. One of the successes of this campaign was the imaginative use of ships and boats. And they were called Townsend's Regatta. And basically, as you can see on that picture, they improvised guns on boats. They strapped on bits of armament, bits of metal to try and stop the bullets getting through. And they had to use the river because there was no opportunity for manoeuvre elsewhere. There were no roads and tracks that headed in the right direction. The only thing that headed in the right direction were the rivers. So water was important, improvising boats was important. And so back to this map again, the mission creep. You can see those arrows of how Townsend moves up the river Tigris, and another general, part of the time, moves up the river Euphrates. So there was a two-pronged advance, but the main effort was towards Baghdad. And the first death in the 1st Battalion of the Ox and Bucks was number 9345, Private Percival Phipps. On the 5th of April 1915, he was accidentally drowned. He is remembered in St. Margaret's Church, Oxford, and also on the War Memorial in Basra. Nasiriyah was one of the earlier battles that took place on the Euphrates. The 2nd Battalion of the Queen's Own Royal West Kents suffered 33% casualties there. There was appalling medical support. Although there were lots of boats, there weren't enough boats to bring up the supplies, and then not enough boats, the same boats, to bring back the wounded, casualties, etc. Logistics didn't work. And they found the enemy could be tough. So that was the Battle of Nasiriyah and that experience. Meanwhile, we move forward to September 1915, where there was the Battle of Kut. And the picture there shows the Dorsets. At that particular battle, they seized the place and they carried on moving up the river Tigris, but the enemy were becoming more capable. And then we get to a place which you can see in this picture called Ctesiphon, which of course the British soldier translated to Pistopon. And at this place there was a Pyrrhic victory. Yes, Townsend won the battle, but he had a lot of casualties and he had to withdraw. He'd underestimated the enemy, he's pushed up the river too far, and he pulled back to Kut. So here is a blown up picture, if you like, of Kut. You saw it on the big map earlier on, and you can see it's basically a U-bend in the river. And the Ox and Bucks and the 17th Brigade were beside two other brigades, and they were in the top right-hand corner, and you can just make out a fort, a mud fort at the top there. The companies of the Ox and Bucks were unusually perhaps numbered, but this is how they did it by tradition. P, Q, R and S companies. And they were in that top right-hand position of the U-bend in a really critical point, as I'll mention in a moment. But this particular U-bend is about 2 miles long, about 1 mile wide, and you've got 21,000 people in it. Now, from one person's quotation about this place, he said, "From a purely military point of view, the Kut Bend was a death trap." So they'd fought their battle at Ctesiphon, they pulled back to Kut. Townsend put his division in there, and he was expecting the relief force to come through. Yes, he'd had casualties, he was regrouping, but he was convinced that he would be relieved within the next few weeks. The sad thing was, of course, he wasn't, and he'd positioned himself where actually it wasn't difficult for the enemy to isolate him by cutting the place off. And here's a sort of blow up of the fort, that top right-hand corner. And in that fort there were the 103rd Maharatas, an Indian regiment. There were 2 15-pounder guns, 6 machine guns, and an element of the Ox and Bucks 1st Battalion. Only in the first few days there, 2nd Lieutenant Brown of the regiment was shot through the head by a sniper. It was a dangerous place to be. And as you can see from this particular slide, this was the sequence of events of the siege over the next few months. And so you have Christmas Eve, in the Christmas period, the main attack, and really the only attack there is during this just over 140-odd day siege. Then you've got the false hope of the relief force coming through in January. They don't get through, so there's uncertainty. What happens next? And then there's a second attempt in March, and then there's a third attempt, a big attempt in April, but none of them get through. It was a difficult place to live. During the Christmas attack, the 103rd Maharatas were practically wiped out. But the Ox and Bucks hang on, and I'll quote from a little history about the regiment. This is during part of that major attack.
For an hour, the gallant defenders held their ground amid the infernal din of gun, machine gun, bomb and rifle fire. Then the machine gun in the centre of the stockade was disabled. The enemy rushed forward within more effective bombing range. One of their bombs fell in the middle of the defenders and killed or wounded most of those on the right half of the stockade, including Major Anderson and Lieutenant Mellor, commanding our company. Still, the 43rd held on, although reduced by over a half. With steady rifle fire, they kept the Turks at bay. At the critical moment, the 48th Pioneers arrived to reinforce the stockade and were immediately involved in heavy fighting, as the result of which the first 30 of them were either killed or wounded. But others took their place, and still the stockade was unconquered. At about midnight, the Turks withdrew, only to resume their attack at 2:30 a.m. But the line held.
So the Ox and Bucks were absolutely critical in the defence of Kut at this stage, and this was the only major attack that took place on Kut. Sergeant Munn commented, "It was courting death to show one's head above ground level." Native Bisties were particularly vulnerable. Now, Bisties were the water carriers. And as you can imagine, they'd have canvas buckets of water trying to quench people's thirst, and they were leaping up and down out of trenches and being shot by the enemy. Because the conditions, you're talking flat ground, the bend of a river. As the months went by, it flooded. It was not pleasant, and they were surrounded by the enemy. Enemy guns could fire into the place easily and locate where the Allies were, and snipers could do the same thing. So snipers and artillery, dangerous. Food, there's a whole story about food. Townshend's staff did not keep him very well informed about food, and he told the relief force that he had less food than he actually had at one point, which meant there was pressure on the relief force to burst through and relieve him, when in fact perhaps they should have been stronger before they did that. There was enough ammunition there. Obviously ammunition was key, but there was only one major attack. They had enough ammunition when they were defended, but the health rapidly went down, as you can imagine in those sorts of conditions, and I've already mentioned the rain and the flooding, and morale was remarkably good for most of the time, but obviously wearing as they got to the end. Here's another little quotation from the regimental history, and this applies to this sort of period in February.
By the end of the month, the ration of each man, the 1st 43rd, consisted of 1 pound of horseflesh, 3/4 of a pound of inferior bread, 1 ounce of jam, and a small issue of dates and tea. The shortage of sugar and tobacco was particularly hard to bear.
Wasn't a pleasant place to be. And then Lieutenant Naylor of the regiment describes in his diary,
"The ration of bread was 8 ounces. Each officer had his own small loaf, which was divided in the morning into 4 equal parts. Breakfast consisted of a quarter of bread, a small piece of horse meat, usually fried as a steak, and a cup of tea. Lunch the same as breakfast, except for the tea."
He also goes on to say,
"By the end of the month, the stench of the decomposing Turkish dead in front of the fort was so overwhelming, so revolting and noisome, that efforts were made to remove the cause. Every night for a week, a fatigue party went out and dragged the mangled remains of the enemy into the ditch which skirted the walls. Having lain exposed for 3 months, the bodies disintegrated as soon as they were touched. It was therefore no easy task."
just reinforcing what the life was like for those people in the siege. And there was the ultimate sacrifice, and here are 3 headstones still there of Ox and Bucks soldiers. What about the relief force, the Tigris Corps as it became known as? You can see these 3 generals' faces on this slide. Well, General Aymer got the nickname Failmer because he couldn't break through. And then you have Gorringe, nicknamed Blood Orange. A big man, highly coloured, deeply tanned, officious and totally without taste. And then you have Maud. Now Maud is the successful one. When I was in Baghdad, the British general lived in Maud House, named after Maud. He had a reputation for competence. He was a detail man. He was a guardsman, detail man, disciplined. He would listen, and he would be the man who would go on to take Baghdad, although unfortunately he would die in Baghdad from disease. Now this slide is labelled Heroism, and it shows a picture of Lance Naik Lala, or Lance Corporal Lala, of the 41st Dogras, saving a British officer's life. And he actually ended up saving 2 British officers' lives and was awarded the Victoria Cross. I put that there because, of course, the backbone of this army was Indian. But Townshend was not always very pro his Indian troops. The fact he was in the Indian army seems rather strange, but perhaps that's one for a question later on. There was no doubt of their individual heroism. So now we come back to the battles for the attempted relief. And in January 1916, as I said, there was this first attempt with a number of battles, which I'm not going through in detail, Sheikh Saad, the Wadi, and the Hana Defile. But during this time, a draft arrived to form the 2nd 43rd. So this is a 2nd battalion of the local regiment. And they were commanded by Major Lindsay Carter, and eventually would make up about 400 men of the 28th Brigade of the 7th Division. And there were a lot of casualties in these assaults. An example of one of the sort of rate of casualties effect was the build-up of a composite battalion, which was made up from the Buffs and the Hampshires, which was called, inevitably, the Huffs. This map is really important because it shows how the Turks were able to fend off that relief force and continue to surround Kut. On the left-hand side there's Kut. On the right-hand side is the sort of direction of travel. They're going from right to left, trying to relieve Kut. They've got to use the river because that's the only method of transport with the boats and so on, and with the artillery. But look where the marsh is. There's a huge marsh to the north. There's marshes actually to the south as well. And so if you're the enemy, it's not that difficult to block the route. And it's flat ground. And it's difficult to actually fire artillery accurately in this particular situation. And there are all sorts of pictures of an attempt to get better visibility by Heath Robinson contraptions, putting people up in the air from the flat ground so they can look further forward with their binoculars. None of that really worked. And so many of the attacks taking place were frontal attacks across flat ground, often in daylight, without accurate artillery fire. Hence, so many casualties. And so the battles for the attempt to break through continue. And in March, there's the 2nd attempt on the Dujela redoubt and Essin. But there was a failure again to achieve surprise. And then we come to April. And April, there's a series of further battles, but also other events to try and break through, which are quite interesting. The first thing, though, and this was disastrous really, was the first major battle of the 2nd 43rd. In the Battle of Sanayat, which you can see on that list, they had 88% casualties. And from the regimental histories,
Of the 16 officers of the 2nd 43rd who went into this first battle of Sanayat, 5 were killed, Captain Hammock died of his wounds and 6 were wounded. Lieutenants Kinghorn, Seymour and Radford and 2nd Lieutenant Rance escaped. Of the 266 non-commissioned officers and men who went into the action, 51 were killed, 170 wounded and 14 missing, a total of 235. For conspicuous services, the commanding officer of the 2nd 43rd, Major James Carter, was awarded a Distinguished Service Order. Captains Hammock and Foljam were mentioned in dispatches, and the only man of the regiment recommended for gallantry, Private Golding, a stretcher bearer, received the Distinguished Conduct Medal.
But this was a bloody battle for the 2nd 43rd. The next slide really is coming towards the surrender, but before that, other little stories occurred which I've got to mention. But these are not direct to the regiment, but they are important in this particular attempt to relieve the place. The first is that a certain Captain T. Lawrence, later Lawrence of Arabia, appears on the scene, because he is a junior officer at this stage, not well known at this stage, but he, with one of the intelligence officers, is sent forward to try and bribe the Turks to actually give them £1 million in order for the garrison to get out and return to Allied lines. Inevitably, that did not work. Why would the Turks want to do that when they were on the point of seizing Kut? Then we have the story of air supplies, and you can see the picture of the aircraft. In those sorts of conditions, just to get the aircraft up in the sky, fly it around a bit and land it is a challenge in itself, but actually to conduct an operation and to drop supplies is a major, major challenge. But they tried to do so, but there were only really maximum, often half a dozen aircraft. They were pretty flimsy, and again, a Heath Robinson sort of effect of strapping some things in a bag, the bag attached to the bottom of the aircraft, flying over and dropping things. But many historians would say that this is the first example of air resupply, though very, very basic. But that wouldn't keep the garrison alive, because the garrison at this stage was beginning to starve. And that's why they ultimately surrendered. And then we have the SS Julna affair. And this involves a number of volunteer naval personnel, all chosen as single men, who basically, with a particular naval officer who knew the river very, very well, to load up a ship called a boat, big boat called the Julna, with supplies, strap bits of metal around the outside in order to have some sort of bulletproofing. And the idea was to, if you like, take that boat into Kut, and that would keep them going for a bit longer. Well, it was obvious it was coming. There was only one route it would come along the river. Booms were put out by the enemy that stopped it coming through, and in fact the officer who commanded that particular group was shot dead by the Turks. It didn't get through. So every effort was made to relieve Kut, but it was not relieved, and the garrison surrendered. So we now move quite quickly really to what happened afterwards. And at this stage, the officers and the soldiers were separated, and the officers for the rest of the war had an unpleasant life, sometimes really unpleasant, but not as unpleasant as the soldiers, because the officers mainly were taken to towns, villages in the middle of the Ottoman Empire and just guarded. And a lot of the time they were very, very bored, whilst a lot of the soldiers were actually taken to build railways, often supervised by German engineers. And you can see now a slight parallel with the Japanese and the Turks in terms of the Second World War and the First World War. They were not treated very well. In fact, they were treated abominably. But the Turk had a different attitude about certain things than the British soldier at that stage. And if you were a Turkish soldier, you didn't have much. The uniform wasn't that brilliant. You weren't fed enormous amounts of food. Conditions for a Turkish soldier were not brilliant. So what are they going to do for a prisoner? And as I said, these prisoners were very weak. They'd been besieged for all these months. They were emaciated, poor diet, lots of disease, very, very weak. And so as they were split off and sent away to these different places around the empire, and you can see on the map, it's a huge area. The soldiers in particular had to march hundreds of miles, and it was in poor conditions. One quotation was that if a man lagged under the burning sun, he was either clubbed mercilessly on the head or left to die by the wayside, as the cries of "Yella, Yella, move on," carried on. And the Reverend Spooner, who was one of the padres, said, "It made my blood boil to witness the treatment of our troops." An example of this was Private Carter of our company of the 1st Ox and Bucks. He was a cook, and he died within 3 miles of Kut and was buried where he fell. The regimental history on the surrender says,
At 5:30 p.m, the regiment, with belts, water bottles and haversacks, marched out of the fort, staggering under its kit. There was no transport. Then the regiment of thick-set, dusty, dirty and tired-looking Turkish infantry, laden with their full field service kits, the type which the regiment had helped to defeat on 3 occasions, marched in and took over the defences.
Kut had been taken. It was a total disaster, but of course that sort of thing does not receive too much publicity, particularly in the bigger picture of the First World War. Another example of how they were handled, as in the prisoners.
At Afyonkara Hisar and Angora, our men received brutal and cowardly treatment from the Turks. But eventually the flogging and maltreatment of the prisoners by the commandant at Afyonkara Hisar became so notorious that even the Turkish government was constrained to dismiss him. This satanic sadist sold the men's clothes and had them bastinadoed if they did not hand in their blankets. In the bitterly cold winter months, they were allowed 1 blanket and a quilt but no mattress. They were crowded in small rooms with an inadequate supply of fuel. One prisoner was flogged and imprisoned on a bread and water diet for a fortnight for burning verminous clothing. The hospital resembled a shambles rather than a house of healing. The weak were beaten because they were helpless. They were injected with some brandy-coloured fluid from the effects of which they never recovered. Those who could not feed or wash themselves were left to die of starvation in their own ordeal. The story is one of nauseating barbarity, but some lion-hearted men survived.
It's an incredible story. Now, on this slide, you can see where the prisoners went to. I'm not going through all the detail of that, but it's just to give you an idea how different people were treated very differently. So, Townsend, when Kut surrendered, a rather smart Turkish motorboat turns up. He's given a Turkish adjutant. He's allowed to take his dog with him, and off he goes to live on an island in a rather nice cottage until the end of the war. This is near Constantinople. Some of the senior officers were grouped together and put in a place called Brusa. And then you had, as I said, the split between officers and other ranks in different places. And some of the places were pretty difficult, like Bakshi. And actually, members of the Ox and Bucks did end up in Bakshi. And then, of course, the Turks tried to separate off the different religious elements within the Indian army, because actually they could play the card that the great British Empire had lost this battle. They'd lost face. And actually, if you were a Muslim, why wouldn't you join the Turkish army? Although there's no records that I've been able to find that actually show Indians transferring their loyalties. So off they went to different places, as you saw on that map of the Ottoman Empire. And on this slide, you can say on the survival side, officers were bored. They were probably in slightly better conditions generally, and therefore part of their duty perhaps was to escape if they could. But where do you escape to when you're in the middle of nowhere, which most of the Ottoman Empire was? Well, even some of the officers signed a rather controversial thing called the Changri Promise, whereby they said they wouldn't escape. And as they said they wouldn't escape, they were told their conditions would be okay. The key personalities with the soldiers were the senior NCOs. They're the ones that actually had the most difficulty just keeping their soldiers alive. And I've got a picture there of Sergeant Major Billy Leach, who actually died imprisoned. He was in the 1st 4th Hampshires, a territorial, before the war, and the 1st 4th were a territorial unit, which was also split between a part of the relief force and Kut. He kept that group of Hampshire soldiers going. And unfortunately, you can see his death plaque in the picture as well. He died of typhus. But he was loved by all the troops. And the Ox and Bucks had the equivalent of Billy Leach. They had Thomas Love. And Thomas Love is the one who kept the regiment together, or the soldiers together. And just a little sort of a snippet about him. Thomas Love, he was actually born in Woking, Surrey, as a labourer. Joined the Oxfordshire Light Infantry at Slough on the 4th November 1897. He served in South Africa and India. But he was appointed temporary regimental sergeant major on the 12th of October 1915. And he was basically the guy who was placed in command of the 250 plus men of the battalion as they marched into captivity. As I've said, they were weakened by disease, subjected to forced marches, starved, beatings, and indifference. So many people dying in captivity. But Captain Neville, who wrote the history of the 43rd and 52nd Light Infantry, said about him,
Upon Regimental Sergeant Major Love DCM descended the mantle of leadership, and as ever in the history of the 43rd, this gallant warrant officer assumed it all and all its responsibilities. Sick though he was, he never spared himself in his efforts to protect those in his charge. Quick to realise that the lives of his men depended on him, he enforced discipline and self-control with all the strength of his character and training, at the cost of his popularity. Ably supported in his endeavours by Quartermaster Sergeant Burbage DCM, Sergeant Ward DCM and the non-commissioned officers. Vilified and insulted and reviled by the Turks, he never for one moment surrendered to the enemy, though their prisoner, nor gave up the unequal contest. His wholly admirable conduct under treatment which few Englishmen have ever been called upon to endure should be remembered by those who have the honour to serve in the 43rd as an example of leadership, courage and determination.
And amazingly, he actually survived the war, was mentioned in dispatches and was awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal. But he kept what was left of the regiment together. The next slide you can see talks about a little bit of escape, and there's an improvised escape kit from a Hampshire regiment officer. And that still exists, and that's in the Winchester Museum of the Royal Hampshire Regiment. But there are an example of the one camp called the Yozgad, where 8 officers managed to get away. They walked 450 miles and eventually got to Cyprus after 36 days' worth of struggling to get past the Turks. And then we have another story about a couple of officers who pretend they can operate a Ouija board. And they end up persuading the Turks that they're partly mad. They even try and commit suicide to prove that they're partly mad. And they do work their ticket in the sense that they're repatriated. However, they were repatriated in November 1918. So there's a lot of effort to get repatriated slightly earlier than the end of the war. And then you have some pictures like this, coming home, the survivors, the few survivors from all of this. And this picture is actually from that territorial battalion I mentioned earlier, the 1st 4th Hampshires in Winchester. So a quick sort of assessment as I come to the end. Yes, it was a major disaster. There was a Mesopotamia commission and various reports and so on, trying to identify what went wrong. But at that time, they didn't really bring out all the factors that went wrong. The Arab, there was an attitude that if you invade the Arab territory, the Arabs would be supportive to you. That didn't really prove the case. And a total underestimation of the capability of the Turk, who, as that relief force pushed forward, found that they were good soldiers. They were dug in and held fast. They were a tough enemy. And then there was the Indian Army. I've not had a chance to really talk about that in detail. Might come up in questions. But the Indian Army was not geared for expeditionary warfare. It was geared for outposts in the northwest frontier with their logistics supplies, going out for short patrols, coming back in. The artillery they had was not particularly good, and there wasn't much of it. Their officers, they could all speak the language when we started this war. They were all part of the Indian Army. Officers, of course, suffered in terms of casualties more than anybody else. The young officers, as soon as they were gone, how do you replace these young officers in the Indian Army? You start running out of people who can speak the language and can command as effectively. And so there were challenges at the lower level. And then at the higher level, I've talked about divisions, a little bit about brigades. The staff were all improvised for these brigades and divisions. They were not used to working together. They had not been trained together. And so there's elements of challenges at the tactical level through to higher levels. And I've already mentioned the strategic level and the competing ideas about whether it was worthwhile pushing to Baghdad or not. Logistics, absolutely. This whole campaign revolved around the ability to get the supplies up and to get the casualties back, and that it couldn't match the requirement. And morale incredibly lasted pretty well towards the end. But here is a comment from the Mesopotamia Commission report, and there were many other reports in the 1920s and 30s, which really sort of sums up some of the issues or challenges that they had. And you can see there it was concentrating in this particular time on the transport, medical resources, supply system, and the equipment. What about the human effect on the light bulbs, on the regiment, the local regiment? Well, there's some statistics for you. 146-day siege, 100 killed, 308 surrendered, 50 died at what was called the Shumram Bend just outside Kut, even before they travelled anywhere. 213 died in captivity, 45 returned home. And in the relief force, as I said, at the Battle of Sanayat, 88% casualties. So the Ox and Bucks Light Infantry, the 1st 43rd, the 2nd 43rd, certainly had the experience of Kut 1916. Let's not forget their sacrifices. So finishing off this talk, there is a quotation from Lieutenant General Graham Lamb. He was the general in Baghdad at the same time that I was there, and he wrote very kindly an afterword to the book on Kut 1916. As you can see, that's his particular view on the leadership that was going on at the time. And finally, there's a picture of the book. It is available on Amazon. I think the story is a good one. It's fascinating what occurred at that time, and we should remember the sacrifices that were made, particularly from the local regiment. Now, please stay with us for the live question and answer session. Thank you very much for listening. On to the questions.
The question and answer session will start shortly. The Q&A window will open below the video window. Please log in or use the guest chat link to ask a question.
Hello and good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'm David Innes, a trustee of the Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum. Delighted to see you tonight, to welcome you to this talk and this question and answer session this evening. Thank you very much indeed, especially to Patrick Crowley for his excellent presentation on this tragic story. A desperate tale, but glimmers of courage and fortitude to lighten it a bit. Patrick is joining us online. Good evening, Patrick, and thank you very much for your presentation tonight. I'm sure we'll get some questions coming through in a minute. By the way, it's pouring with rain here, so we've got a metal roof above us, so if there's any interference, that could be part of it. I do have a question for you coming in, Patrick, now, which is really relating to the point you made about General Townsend early on in your talk. You rather indicated that he didn't care for the Indian Army's servicemen under his command. And I wonder why he actually was serving in the Indian Army for that reason.
Well, thank you very much, David. Thanks for inviting me to do the talk this evening. And thank you to the last time I counted just over 100 people who have turned up. And please give your support to the Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum. So as a plug. Yeah, he's an interesting chap, is Major General Townsend. And I suppose it's summed up by the fact that the title of the book he wrote, his autobiography, was called My Campaign in Mesopotamia, which perhaps sort of sums up the sort of character he might be. But I mentioned in the talk, he was a little bit of a thruster, and he started off in the Royal Marine Light Infantry in 1881. And he was always trying to get to the best jobs. And of course, at that time of history, the place where most of the action was and perhaps opportunities were India. So he applied to the Indian Staff Corps and didn't get in to start off with. Instead, he went off on campaign to Egypt. But then he did end up in the Indian Staff Corps, where he saw opportunities, and he was in the Central India Horse. And he became a commanding officer of an Indian battalion, the Imperial Kashmir Contingent, it was called. So he sought glory, and in a sense, he got that, because at Chitral, which I mentioned, the siege, he became quite well known, and was awarded the sort of award, I think it was the CB, which you don't normally get at the rank relatively junior rank he was. But in my campaign in Mesopotamia, he's not very nice about his Indian troops, and yet I also gave you the story of the bravery of that Lance Corporal Allah. But he followed the sort of career to start off with that many officers of his generation did. So he was in India. He ended up as a officer, as a brigadier in South Africa, sort of tail end of the Boer War. He ends up going back to England. He's not happy because he's given a territorial army division to command. He complained about that. That's the last thing he wanted, the Home Counties division. And then he was surprised because he was actually sent to command a Rawalpindi brigade in 1914 in India. But he was writing all the time, if you like, writing to the military secretariat and his friends. He wrote to Kitchener, basically saying, I want to command in France. So he saw, the shift of emphasis was moving from India to France. That's where he wanted to be. He wanted glory in France. And he even got his wife to try and influence a posting to France. She was French. No, he tried everything to get to the Western Front. As far as he was concerned, he was in a forgotten place at this stage. And of course, when this particular campaign starts, he's then quite happy he's there. But he complains throughout the campaign that he hasn't, he's not receiving promotion. And he was complaining about that throughout captivity and when he came back to this country. So yes, a very strange relationship with the Indian soldier, because he sort of points out in his autobiography that he wasn't particularly happy with the way they performed in certain ways. Very strange indeed, when in fact he had spent quite some time in India. Very hard to understand. But that's why he was there. It was the glory of earlier times. He got that at Chitral, and of course, at any opportunity, he tried to get away. But then, of course, he had an opportunity again. And with the 6th Division, he was actually a very popular man right up until the end, because they didn't realize all the detail of what had happened. And he was picked up by a motorboat. He was given his adjutant and allowed to keep his dog, and went off to this island near Constantinople, very well looked after. But when he climbed onto this little motorboat from Kut, the soldiers were cheering him, because up until that point, all the way through the rivers, up the river, Tigris and so on, he'd won the battles. They thought that he was a great chap. Unfortunately, didn't take a lot of interest in the prisoners when they were captured by the Turks. But that's another little story.
And he allowed himself to get caught in the bend of the river at Kut.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. I've got a few questions coming in now for you, Patrick. This is an interesting one. Henry Spielberg asks about how serious was the £1 million bribe offered by T.E. Lawrence? How would it have been funded? They must have gone through that, I suppose, or was it a bluff? He wants to know.
Well, I haven't ever managed to find much detail about this, though I have dug as deep as I can. The bottom line is, why would the enemy want to accept that money anyway? They certainly didn't go to do that deal with the Turks, with bags of coin. So how much of it was genuine upfront, I couldn't tell you. But a senior intelligence colonel led the discussion. There was a huge effort to avoid just being seen to be stupid. But of course, the press did get hold of the story and were not impressed when they got that story. But all the elements of this particular tale didn't really receive much publicity. at the time, as I said at the beginning of the talk, there was so much going on that people just did not hear about this until much later. There were other things, and one element which I didn't mention, of course, was that there was humiliation, and
Exactly.
the Turks really made the most of this defeat. And more recently, the president of Turkey has made a fuss of Kut, as he has made a fuss of Gallipoli. So they were in a position then, as they are now, to say, well, this is glorious. And there's a religious spin to this as well, which is, this is a certain type of person beating the white empire. And so, it could inspire others to do similar things. And the tales of Kut, the tales of what happened in Gallipoli, of course, did affect some of the what was happening in India in terms of people who were not happy to stay in the empire. So there were good examples of us, if you like, not doing very well. Sorry, I haven't answered the direct question very well indeed. But yeah, the money piece, it's just another way of getting through. They were throwing everything at it at the end. For example, with the Julna.
Yeah. I've got a question here from Arman Savarian. Considering Afghanistan and the British Army's involvement there recently, should the British Army now prioritize the study of defeats such as that at Kut?
Well, that's a very interesting question. Thank you, Arman, for that. Well, the defeat at Kut, I think, is deserving study. Not just because it's a good story. It's not a good story. It's a bad story. But there are really good examples of the strategic level, people not getting their act together. So different views coming from the Indian theatre, coming from Britain at that time. There is sort of dispute at the lower levels, right down to the bottom, in terms of how people were commanded, the sort of types of equipment they had, the languages they were able to speak, the use of support, fire support. There's a whole panoply of lessons which, okay, this is a long time ago, it's 1916, but many of those lessons can be pulled out and used as examples of things that went wrong and which could have been corrected. And yes, one could think of today. The General Nixon was castigated in the report that were reported on this disaster. And General Nixon was that connection between the land forces on the ground and the command above him, India or England. So Nixon, that sort of equivalent general still exists today normally, and he's the bridge between the politics and senior command sometimes and those on the ground. And so there's all sorts of lessons at that sort of level, right down into the weeds. So yes, of course we should study defeats. In fact, often the defeats are the better ones to study than the successes.
Thank you very much indeed for that question. I've got a question here from P.W. Quigley, who says, our grandfather was there, Conductor Joe Quigley, and testified at Fratel's trial in 1919. Comments appreciated.
Sorry, I missed that last bit, sorry.
He said, and testified at Fratel's trial. Now, I'm not quite sure about Fratel, are you?
No, I'm not, no.
He was obviously involved in some kind of post-operational inquiry. So we can't really answer that question. Is that what we're saying? I think we are, aren't we?
Yeah, I don't know of a Fratel. I'm not sure what context he's in. I'm
going to go back to Mr. Quigley and say, please, can you give us any more detail about the trial in 1919? That would be very helpful to help. We'll keep the question on the screen in the meantime. Rowley Grimshaw, who I'm very pleased to hear from, Rowley says, can you tell us a bit more about the failure of the relief forces to get through to Kut?
Yeah,
and heavy rain play a big part in hindering their movement?
Well, there's lots of little bits to this. One of them is the fact that as I said during the talk, that because of Townsend's reports that he was running short of food, the relief force was always trying to perhaps do too much too early before it had all the resources to do it. So there's that piece to it. The second piece, which I explained with that map with the marshes and the use of the river as the main axis, was you just couldn't get around people, couldn't maneuver around people. The ground is flat. You add the flooding that you mentioned, and there's no surprise. So you had some of the time daylight attacks across open ground where you couldn't bring indirect fire from your guns accurately onto the enemy. You just could not get through. So there's a whole combination of reasons why they couldn't break through. Another aspect, which I think I hinted on, was the Indian Army at that stage. The Indian Army had been built for frontier operations in the northwest of India, not for expeditionary operations. And so the structure of the force, it didn't have as many guns, for example, artillery pieces, that a unit on the Western Front would have, for example. They didn't need so many guns if you were in a little outpost in the northwest frontier of India. If you're in the outpost northwest frontier of India, you don't need the same logistics tail. You don't need the same medical support, which they certainly needed there. So they were, if you like, undergunned, didn't have the logistics support. A whole combination of reasons is why they couldn't get through. I mean, that sort of leads to what happened later. Maud later did get through and occupied Baghdad in March of 1917. Now, Maud is sometimes described as a sort of like a Montgomery figure, in the sense that he always made sure he had the right resources to advance and to attack before he did so. He didn't take major risks. And he actually had a visit before they reassumed the attack, took on the attack again, from General Sir Charles Monro, who I've actually written about. And General Sir Charles Monro was on his way to be Commander-in-Chief in India. And at that stage, they'd had the disaster at Kut. So Monro was briefed fully en route by Maud about what Maud was intending to do. And he persuaded Monro, and you can imagine all the British hierarchy were a bit wary at this stage, having lost that disaster at Kut. He persuaded Monro that he now had the right resources in place. He could defeat the Turks, and he did.
Okay, well done. Thank you very much indeed. I hope that answers your question, Rowley. Rowley's grandfather was a battalion commander in the Indian Army at that time.
Marvelous. Can I step in with the post-war piece, because it may be connected to the Quigley question, or I don't know if he comes back to us.
Yeah.
But, there was obviously at the end of the war there was a temptation to do a similar thing as reparations, effectively harsh reparations on the Turks.
Yeah.
Especially as people by that time knew that the soldiers in particular had been treated so badly. And there was a particular prisoner who escaped, officer prisoner, who tried to generate interest politically to give the Turks a hard time, really have tight reparations. But that all happened at the wrong time, because of course people wanted the new Turk, the old empire to fall apart, but for the new Turkish Republic effectively to get set up and be successful. And so there was political pressure against taking reparations on Turkey for how troops were treated.
That's a helpful point to make. Thank you very much. Yes. A question from Bryn Howell Price, who I well remember in the Territorial Army in Oxfordshire in the 80s. Bryn, good evening to you. The number of machine guns, he says, seems a very small number. Was this the usual establishment?
Well, I'll be honest, I don't know the exact answers to that question. The number of machine guns, as I'm sure Bryn knows, went up in units as the war progressed. But again, we're into Indian Army figures, and I couldn't tell you off the top of my head how many machine guns were in each unit, but they certainly would not have had the enhanced numbers of machine guns that quickly, ended up on Western Front units. So as far as the number of machine guns actually mentioned, that was specifically in that fort earlier on. So I don't know how many machine guns were across the whole position. but I'd have to look into that a bit more carefully.
Okay, going back to the Quigley question, he's come back saying Joe Quigley was with the engineers. He credited Frattel with saving his life at Bagchi. King later pardoned Frattel, but James Horgan also comes in with a point here, which is try this link, and it's the greatwarforum.org/topic, and then it gives Kut cruelty William Frattel. So that may be something to follow up. And we can always, if we can't get the answer tonight, we can always post it on our website subsequently, which we'll certainly do, Patrick, if we get an answer later on.
No, that sounds fascinating. And Bakshi, as I said, was one of the worst places to be.
Actually, James Horgan says that Frattel of the Indian Army Medical Department, he'd been the British medical officer at the hospital at Bagchi, which of course was where some of the prisoners were held, no doubt.
Okay. Well, yeah. I will look into that myself. Sounds fascinating. I'll look into that one. Thank you.
A question from...
just a point to mention about captivity. Inevitably, you have some people who are looked after a bit better than others, and all the rest of it. And there was some conflicting evidence about the German engineers, for example. So the majority of the German engineers were actually, helped some of the prisoners as best they can, seeing the conditions they were in. But there are others who did not. And amongst the people who are looking after prisoners, inevitably, there were some nasty pieces of work, and there were others who were more helpful. It's never as simple as one would think it should be, because of the conditions that people were in.
Thank you for that. Pausing for a second during this question and answer session, can I just say how very much your donations tonight are appreciated by the soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum. They actually are our lifeblood, and we receive no public funding of any kind as a museum, and so anything that we earn ourselves is how we get by, really. And we've had a generous audience tonight who have joined us, and we're very pleased to see you. But if you could consider chipping in a tenner or even a fiver for your ticket to see the talk tonight, then that would be hugely appreciated and make a tremendous difference to us. So thank you very much for that. You can register for these talks by joining our mailing list. There is a link to that below the chat facility at the bottom of the screen. And I hope people will do that so that you get regular updates on what's going on in the museum. For those on SWIFT, which is the Rifles Network, there is a special SOFO dedicated page there with information about what goes on in the museum. And I would like to commend, if I could, this book, whilst I've got the opportunity, Mesopotamia, 1914 to 1915, by Henry Birch Reynardson, which has been recently republished thanks to the efforts of his grandson, Thomas, and granddaughter, who very kindly have put the energy into having the book republished, and you can buy this book through the museum. I thought I might actually just read to you a paragraph from this book, because Patrick has been saying tonight how everything depended upon transport and movement up and down the rivers. And so you'd wonder where all the boats were coming from. And this little paragraph is about the movement of troops by boat. And I think it's interesting and instructive because it gives us an indication for the enormous logistic effort that was required for this operation. This is mid-1915 we're talking about. So at this stage, things are going forward. The three battalions at Kurna, the Oxenbucks, the 119th and the 103rd Marathas, were to move across the marshes to a position west of Fort Snipe, and from there attack the positions on the right bank, while the 22nd Punjabis were to act independently on the left bank against One Tree Hill. The whole brigade moving in bellums. Now, a bellum is a shallow draft river craft. For this, an average of 65 boats per battalion was necessary. Each bellum was to carry 10 men, 2 to pole or punt the thing along, 8 to fight with their equipment, reserve ammunition, water, picks, shovels, rope, caulking materials, spare poles and paddles, and so on. In addition, he says, boats had to be found for the signal company and for the field ambulance, and also for the machine gun sections and a battery of mountain guns. These latter were mounted on rafts made from two vellums decked together. Nearly every vellum, and there must have been quite 300 of them, with its full equipment, had to be towed up from Basra, collected by the brigade vellum officer, there's a title for you, and then handed over to the battalions. I think that gives an interesting insight into the kind of logistics they were dealing with. And as a force that was not used to expeditionary warfare, this was an enormous undertaking, you can see. On with the questions, if that's okay. This is from Liz Wade, and Liz has asked questions, I know, of us before in our talks, so thank you, and good evening, Liz. Was the disaster at Kut, she asks, hushed up because of the possible effect on morale back in the UK, or was Mesopotamia just too remote?
That's a very good question, Liz. And again, it's never a simple answer. As I said a little bit earlier, actually, people were more concerned that, if you like, the Muslim has succeeded in beating the white man in this particular campaign. So actually, that's what they were trying to avoid. They were more concerned about the bad news and how it might affect certain groups in India and perhaps other parts of the empire than they were really what the effect might be back on the mainland. But we go back to what I said at the beginning. You know, you've got the Somme, you've got Verdun, you've got Jutland, you've got Ireland. You know, there's a lot going on, and it's a bit like when you write a story about a regiment. The story about the regiment can take up a massive book, and it was on the Second World War or the First World War. You'd have to have volumes and volumes if you wanted all the detail, and so this is a sideshow, relatively. And you've also got the influence of Westerners versus Easterners. Actually, some of the Westerners would be quite happy that, to a degree, that this was a disaster, because they say, well, you know, what's the point of doing that? We want the resources on the Western Front. So perhaps not so much hushed up, but not made a fuss of. I mean, there were a number of commissions that were straight in there analysing what went wrong. And even those were tainted by the Times. So they did not make too much of a fuss about all the commanders. You know, they picked on a couple. They made a huge fuss about the logistics, but they didn't mention some of the other things which I've mentioned. So yes, I mean, you've got to place yourself in the time. And what are you going to do? You're going to make a fuss about the fact you've escaped from Gallipoli, that sort of Dunkirk moment. You're not going to make a fuss about this disaster.
No, okay. Tony Aldridge asks, was there any advantage to the wider campaign to tie so many Turkish troops to the Kut siege? And how was Baghdad eventually taken?
No, but that's a good question. And we mustn't forget that at this stage, the Russians were moving in from the east. And that was one of Townsend's. Tony's asking a clever question here. He probably knows the answer, I think. But Townsend, one of his defences, if you like, was, you know, we're tying down more Turkish troops here. Well, to a degree, because of course troops from Gallipoli had been released, and there had been a lot there. So, but they were dealing with the Russians elsewhere. Yes, I mean, there is that argument that some elements were tied down because the forces were there. Absolutely. Parallel discussion perhaps about Italy in the Second World War. You know, people were tied down. No doubt about that. But yeah, so the Indian Army was bogged down until that point where, as I said, Maud pushed forward and took Baghdad when he knew he had the resources.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Stephen Barker, who is an eminent historian himself and is well known in the Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum as a close friend. Actually, Stephen, very nice to hear from you tonight. What are your views, he wants to know, about the recent findings of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission about the non-commemoration of Indian soldiers, who plainly played a huge part in this campaign, Patrick?
Well, I think that this campaign should be remembered. I think most of the time it's forgotten, and it was dominated by the Indian Army. So individual heroism, individual action should be remembered just as much as any of the other forces that participated. Is my view, and it should be recognised. And history has changed, has it not, over the years? One of the forebears of my own regiment had the first black infantry officer serving. We didn't hear much of that for a number of years, but in recent years, thank goodness, his performance has come forward, and he's been recognised. So in the same way, everyone should be recognised for what they achieved. And I think that's as much as one can say. Certainly, they should be recognised for their huge achievement, as should everybody who was in that campaign.
Thank you. Good. J.R. Imbush, this is from, asks whether Townsend should retreat into Basra immediately and not stopped at Kut. It might have been a better bet for him.
No, that's a very good question. And that is one of the arguments that one can debate about. And that one, again, you could sort of apply that to perhaps modern campaigns or whatever. As he advanced towards there, as I said, Brigadier came up to them and sort of said, you don't want to stay here. That was basically a chap who was experienced. He knew the conditions. And he said the last thing you want to do is stay here. That was his view. But if you put yourself back in Townsend's position, yes, he'd had casualties at the Battle of Ctesiphon. He'd withdrawn back to the next logical place, and then we're into the underestimation of the enemy, aren't we? So he was quickly isolated, and the relief force did not get through. But of course, they all thought, we're British, we're British Empire. That relief force is going to get through. They were very confident the relief force would get through, and therefore they thought there'd be no problem stopping at Kut because they would get through. If the assessment with hindsight, yes, a logical thing would be to push further back to Basra, but of course he had a lot of casualties from Ctesiphon. So he had to balance how far he went back and looking after those casualties. All those things balanced, all those factors as he did his estimate as to what to do next. He made the wrong decision. Yes, he probably should have come further back. But other things would have suffered as a result, but it wouldn't have been so much of a disaster.
Question on the logistics here, Patrick, from Dick Wilkinson. Can the logistic failings be laid at the door of the Army Service Corps at the time, or did the fault lie with higher command, do you think?
Hello, Dick. Thanks very much for listening to watching this again. I know Dick well. Dick lives in the same village as me. Actually, as always, nothing is simple. We come back to the Indian Army and the logistic tail that it didn't really have because it wasn't designed to have a major logistic tail. And I think fundamentally that was a considerable reason why it went wrong. Now, as people got on with that campaign, they realized they didn't have enough boats. And they needed more gunboats, they needed more transport boats, and they ordered them. But these things some of them were being made in India, and they had to get them then to the place. So they realized they needed them, but as the campaign progressed, they didn't have them. And of course, the mission creep piece of when Townsend pushes up, if you like, too far, he has not got the support to keep him going, and he has not included that factor in his estimate. So there were people who realized there were gaps in the resources and the logistics that they had, but they had the set of cards, if you like, that they were given as they started off, and that wasn't enough for the ambitions of pushing forward to Baghdad.
Very good. That's helpful. Thank you very much indeed. Rory Grimshaw has come back with one other point by way of thanks to you, Patrick. He says his grandfather was killed at Amara. It's called Ewing Grimshaw, I know that.
Yeah.
His second in command was Claude Auchinleck, later the Field Marshal, of course.
No, well, thank you. Thank you very much for that. And, it is amazing how when one does a talk like this, there's always somebody in the audience who has got that personal connection, which brings it even more to life. I've had one person come up with a notebook, written by a soldier during the siege, things like that. It is amazing the connections that are still out there. So thank you very much indeed for that.
Stephen Campion has got a question, and it came in quite a long time ago. I've been thinking about whether to ask this question, because I think I know the answer to this, Stephen, almost certainly. But let's see what Patrick makes of it. Did any of those released from captivity subsequently receive any psychiatric assessment or counselling?
Well, the answer is almost certainly no, because that's not really what happened at that time. Certainly, those extreme examples, people were obviously had significant problems. I'm sure would have been admitted to hospitals or whatever. But in general terms, no.
No. Okay. I thought that would be the answer. One question which has arisen was about the Jalna incident, which you mentioned in your story, Patrick. The attempt to break the Turkish blockade around Kut failed. 2 Royal Naval Victoria Crosses were won in that failed attempt to break the blockade. Your book rather indicates that security issues and failings probably gave the game away, and that Jalna was doomed to failure from the start. Do you think that?
No, absolutely. I mean, there was only one way for that boat to go. People saw it being prepared, and no doubt a little bit of spying went on to see what was going on. And you start strapping extra armor on the side. It's obviously going somewhere, and so people knew it was coming. It was not difficult to stop. Interesting character in there. One of the ones who was killed by the Turks actually knew the Ottomans extremely well. He was British, but he was part of the setup of boats before the war, and they knew him.
Was this Crowley? Crowley, was it?
That's Crowley, and they basically thought, well, he's a traitor to us in a sense. They chose the crew for that Jalna trip, from single men who thought they had less to lose than others, and it was a disaster from start to finish. But such was the pressure on trying to break the siege, and one more attempt. Let's have one more go. It happened, but that was also part of the story of the disaster, effectively.
A wasteful failure. What a pity. I can't see it. Yes, I got one more. Yes, an anonymous question. This the dates of the siege. The siege ended on the 29th of April, 1916.
Yep.
It began on the early December, wasn't it?
Yeah, it began in December. Absolutely. Yeah.
Early December.
December to March. Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
I feel that we've come to a natural end of the questions, really. Patrick, unless you've got any other thoughts to offer us, I think we're going to close things down and let people get on with their supper. Have you anything else you want to say to us?
Well, I'll just obviously thank the Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum. I was there when the museum opened. It's fantastic. So please
remember
support anyone who's still watching. And amongst the books, of course, there is Kut 1916, hardback, softback, available on Amazon, etc.
Quite right. Well, thank you very much indeed for that. And so let's draw things to a close for tonight. Just before I do, Thomas Love. He was a superhero, wasn't he? You heard his deed described there by a voiceover, and that was about Thomas Love, the regimental sergeant major. He survived the war, came home to England, and died in 1952 as a Chelsea pensioner. You might like to know that, I think. He had a namesake 100 years before, a famous namesake in the 52nd, the other battalion making up the regiment, the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry. Thomas Love was an officer in the Peninsula, fought at Waterloo, became a lieutenant general in the latter part of the 19th century. There are many stories about Thomas Love which bear looking at. An amusing character and quite a personality, regimental personality. Thank you all very much for your interest, for your questions tonight. I commend absolutely Patrick's book. I'll hold it up again. Here it is, which is a very good read and extremely well researched. Thank you very much to Patrick, of course, to CPM International Limited, based in Thame, for so generously sponsoring us tonight. Your support has made this possible, and we're most grateful. Thank you. To Clive Smith and to of Heidi Borden Video, thank you very much, Clive. He's the other guy in the room here with me, controlling everything, I'm glad to say. And he works with the Army Flying Museum very closely. This is how we got to know Clive, and we're very grateful to them for making us so warmly welcome again. Lastly, a quick thank you to Simon Theobalds. Some of you will have recognized Simon's voice tonight. He was the voiceover, the regimental history voiceover, and we're very grateful to him. Thank you. Next time, we're talking about Colditz. The road to Colditz on the 23rd of November is the date. Two regimental officers, Tom Hamilton Bailey and Stuart Rolt, will tell the stories, the prisoner of war stories of their fathers. Jock Hamilton Bailey, a sapper, and Tony Rolt, a rifleman in the Rifle Brigade. Captured in different places at the fall of France in May 1940, they eventually found themselves both at Colditz. And their stories are hair-raising and absolutely fascinating. It was Tony Rolt who conceived the idea of flying out of Colditz by glider. It didn't happen, but the idea was there, and it came from this infantryman. So please join us to hear that story, those stories told on the 23rd of November. In the meantime, thank you very much again for being with us, and good night.